Hi guys, welcome back to another video on RabbitMQ. In our previous video, we looked at the conceptual basics behind the request reply pattern and how we might achieve this in RabbitMQ. In this video, we're going to look at actually implementing the request reply pattern in Python. If you're more interested in a C# implementation, please stick around for the next video, as both this and the next video will cover the same content but using different programming languages. So as usual, I've started with two files. And instead of having a consumer and a producer, like we saw in the last video, we'll have a client and a server. And in the client, we'll start off with the basic consuming code we had before, while in the server, we'll start off with the basic producer code. But like we saw, both the client and the server, in this case, will both have to consume and publish messages. So let's start off with the implementation on the client side. So it's the client's responsibility to publish requests for the server to consume and also to consume the server's replies. So as usual, the first thing we want to do is open our connection. So this is the same as always with the connection parameters, opening the blocking connection, and then creating the channel. The first thing we want to do is declare a reply queue. So rather than specifying an explicit name for the queue, we can leave that blank and let the RabbitMQ broker assign a name for our queue. And we can also declare this queue as exclusive, which will only allow connections from the current channel. And let's save that in a variable called reply queue. Next, we can set up our consumer to consume off this reply queue. So we can call channel.basicConsume. And as usual, we need to pass this several parameters. So the first thing we need to do is pass the queue that we want to consume off. And in this case, it's the reply queue. So reply queue.method.queue. In this video, we can auto acknowledge the messages to save us some time. We don't need to explicitly implement that. And we also need to provide a message callback. So let's define that up here, and we'll call it onReply message received. As usual, the channel, method, properties, and the body. And we'll simply just log out that we've received a reply. And also just give it the body to print out. So we can take this callback and pass it into our basic consume on message callback, which will set up our basic consume here. We then also need to declare a queue to send the requests to. We'll do this in both the client and the server. So channel queue declare again, and we'll call the queue the request queue. And then we want to publish our requests onto this request queue. So rather than using the letterbox routing key, we'll use the request queue. And like we saw, if we leave the exchange blank, it will use the default exchange. We can use any exchange we want in this, but for simplicity in this implementation, we'll use the default exchange and the routing key request queue. We'll pass the body, which is just the message we want to send. So rather than sending, hello, this is my first message, let's just send something like, can I request a reply? But we also want to pass some properties when we're publishing a message from our client. We want to pass the reply to and the correlation ID properties so we can tell the server where to send the reply to and which request the reply is for. So to do this, in our basic publish, we'll add some properties. So properties equals pika basic properties. And inside this, we can set the reply to be our reply queue that we've already set up. So reply queue dot method dot queue, and also the correlation ID. So what will we set this correlation ID to? Let's just tidy this up a little bit first. So we need to set the correlation ID to say a unique value that represents this message that we've published in. So to do this, we can use a UUID. So we want to import UUID first. And then as we're sending our message, we can define our correlation ID. So we can say correlation ID is equal to UUID.UUID4. And then we probably want to wrap that as a string. So that's our correlation ID generated, and let's send that with our message. So now we're sending a basic message onto the default exchange with the routing key request queue, and we're specifying the reply to and the correlation ID properties, and also the body of the message. And instead of saying sent message here, we'll just say starting client. And because we actually want to consume messages in our client as well as send messages, we have to start our consuming here by saying channel.start consuming. So that's pretty much it from our client point of view. We've defined our callback, our connection, our reply queue, started our basic consume, declared our request queue, and we've also defined our correlation ID and message here. We might want to print out that we're actually sending a message, so we'll just print sending request and also the correlation ID of the request we've sent. Then we publish the message onto the default exchange, and we can print starting the client and start consuming. So that's our client done. Let's jump into our server and see what needs to be done there. So like in our client, our server also needs to consume and publish messages. Again, all of our connection code will be the same, but we'll change our callback for on message received to on request message received, just to clear up that is for the request message. And we'll print out request received. And we can also print out the correlation ID of the message that we received. So we can do that using the properties.correlation ID. And what do we want to do when we receive a request? Well, basically the whole point of the client server and request reply pattern is to send a reply. So to do that, when we're in the callback for on received request, we can actually publish our reply. So channel.basic publish. Again, we want to publish to the default exchange, so we can leave the exchange blank. And the routing key will be the reply to that we sent on the message. So again, we can use properties, reply to, and we can set the body to whatever we want. So we might say, hey, it's your reply to, and we can give the correlation ID again. So properties.correlation ID. So now we've set up our on request message received callback to print out that it's received a request and do a publish on the reply to property of the request received. So like we saw in the client, we also want to declare our request queue here. And that's just in case the server starts before the client, so the queue exists before it starts. We want to consume from the request queue. So we can use basic consume, and the on message callback will be the same as the one we've defined up here. Auto acknowledge true. We can say starting server here. And then we just want to start consuming again. So that's basically it from our server point of view. We don't need to do as much as we're doing in the client. We don't need to generate any correlation IDs or anything like that. That should all be done by the client, and the server is just a pass-through. If we wanted to, we could have also sent the correlation ID on the properties of our basic publish, but to keep it simple, we'll just put it in the body for now. So let's open up a terminal window and see how our client and server interact together. So let's first start up our server so it's ready to receive the requests and publish the replies. So we'll type python server.py. So that will start our server, and we'll open up another terminal beside it where we can start our client. So we'll say python client.py. And we can already see that our request reply pattern is working. So we can see here that we're sending requests with the correlation ID EC382. And we've also received a reply, hey, this is your reply, to EC382. And on the server side, we just see that we've received the request from EC382. So like we expect, the message is being sent from the client to the server. The server is then processing it and publishing it to the reply queue that the client specified, along with the properties of correlation ID, so we can track it through our system. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the Python implementation of the request reply pattern. In the next conceptual video, we'll be looking at the use of some more complicated and different exchanges in RabbitMQ. But in the upcoming video, we'll be looking at a C# implementation of this same pattern. So if you've already watched and understood the Python implementation, please feel free to skip that video. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment.